Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. On this podcast, as you know, if you're a regular listener, we focus mostly on psychology and personal development and how to get a little bit more out of life. To put it simply, and in a way that occasionally makes me internally groan a little bit, we're a self-help podcast. And that phrase shouldn't make me groan at all, because there shouldn't be anything wrong with trying to help yourself. There's a lot to like about self-help. The goal of achieving some kind of reliable happiness and well-being in a very chaotic and often unreliable world sounds pretty great to me. Groups are made up of individuals, and it's really hard for those groups to improve if the individuals they're made up of don't improve. Then why does it make me groan? Why don't I always love being associated with the phrase self-help? Well, self-help has some problems too. From cults of personality to snake oil salesmen to rampant misinformation and pseudoscience, there are plenty of pitfalls to avoid. But even when you get past the obvious stuff, the fake gurus trying to sell you colloidal silver or whatever else, there are still all kinds of issues and complexities about modern self-help content that make me more than a little bit uncomfortable. So today, we're going to be talking about the problems with self-help. To help me do that, I'm joined by a clinical psychologist, and some would say a self-help author himself, Dr. Rick Hanson. Dad, how are you doing today?
I'm good, and I decided to, as consistent with the theme today, to be a little disruptive in my attire, and rather than wearing
the
normal,
black t-shirt. I love this for you. Loosen it up. Join me in t-shirt land, Dad.
It gave me a trend rather than my kind of soft therapist, costume.
Classic Mr. Rogers vibe.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm really glad about this. And one thing about it, I'll just say from the start, a friend of mine once said that in literature, there are basically some small number, call it 10, of fundamental stories throughout humanity. And one of the stories essentially is a stranger came to town. And in that sense, Forrest, you are the stranger with beginner's mind who has come into, just for the last several years, the so-called town, the self-help village, in which, if I haven't been the mayor, I've definitely been on the city council for a while.
You are for sure on the advisory board of the self-help town, Dad. I think that's overtly true.
Or I think, I feel a little bit more like the keeper of the bar, like the bar scene in the first Star Wars movie.
Okay.
With all the characters there.
For the record, Han definitely shot first, but I'm not trying to get us into hot water here from the starters. So I think that's a great framing of it here, Dad, where I've been doing this for about a decade now.
Yeah.
A little bit less, but roughly a decade since we first started working on the book Resilient together. And in my time in self-help world, to kind of steal your language a little bit here, I've definitely bumped my head into this continuous feeling of how do I feel about this kind of content in general? And so that's a bit what we're going to be talking about today, where we're mostly going to stay away from what I'll just call all the nonsense. The pseudoscience, the snake oil, the quantum this or that. We've talked about it on the podcast in the past. We'll probably talk about it again, but we've kind of covered that stuff. And I want to focus more on two big questions. First, what are the more implicit issues that tend to show up in self-help broadly? And then second, what's the right balance in a person's life between trying to grow and improve and get better in different ways versus this kind of relentless craving or churning or seeking that a person can have, where the goalposts of what healed looks like are just constantly pushed back for them. They're always working on something. They're always working on themselves. So they never really get to actually just feel content, smell the roses, and go, wow, I feel pretty good about the way that things are right now. So for starters, Dad, do you want to kind of offer any initial comment about those two targets that I set up there?
First off, I want to say I think this is just brilliant, deep, and you ought to write a book about it someday. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Alongside the fantastic sharing and transmitting that's already occurring through all that you do and in different kinds of media. In any case, something has puzzled me for a long time, and it's simply this. If you think about the physical world around us, it's widely understood that there's a lot of value in what I'll call healthy striving. So you have a kitchen drawer, it's a complete mess. You think, I really got to organize it better. Well, that's perfectly normal and understandable. Similarly, in the physical body, we might think, I've got a hangnail, on my toe. I need to fix that. This is widely understood. And it's widely understood that there can be pitfalls in it. The person, for example, who retreats to their, tool shed to kind of perfect something they're working on as a way to avoid interacting with their own family. Not so good. Well, similarly, applied to the mind, what I've encountered again and again and again is this very peculiar, radical differentiation between what is commonsensical, applied to the physical world and to one's physical body, but don't apply that to the mind. In other words, don't make wise efforts. That's a name check for our friend, Dr. Diana Hill, who has a beautiful book that's just come out called Wise Effort. Great book. Anyway, why not make skillful efforts with regard to your own mind? And why not beware certain pitfalls, the ones I've said? So for me, that's kind of frame here. And I'm really looking forward to exploring healthy striving, wise effort, whatever we want to call it, applied to the domain of the psyche, much as we might apply it to a messy, disorganized kitchen drawer.
Yes. And I think the balance between, okay, the forks should probably mostly go in the fork place and the knives should mostly go in the knife place, distinct from we must polish each piece of silverware so that I can see my own reflection in it. And the moment that there is a water droplet that lands on it that disrupts this perfect picture, I have an emotional moment about it because I just can't take that. Like, that's the healthy balance we're kind of looking for. We're looking for more of category A and less of category B. And I think that speaks to a couple of things that I want people to keep in mind as we're moving through this material. First, middle path. Extremes are where most of the weird stuff hangs out. And broad principle, the right course is normally the healthy balance between these different principles. So you were already talking about that, Dad. Then second, just kind of the 90-10 stuff that we've talked about a lot on the podcast over about the past year. We get most of the rewards from our engagement with something from a variety of relatively small efforts. A relatively small piece of the effort puzzle gives us an overwhelming percentage of the success or rewards that we experience from it. And then finally, something that isn't in those two categories, but I think is still an important one to keep in mind. Why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you are sort of positively motivated toward this sense of, I'm going to feel really good when I have this cleaner kitchen. And it's going to feel nice to have a sense of kind of order around me. Or are you doing that out of more of a negative motivation, a sense of a negative comparison to other people? Are you driven by an underlying feeling of shame or dissatisfaction with the way that you are? Are you doing something out of a sense that there's something that's kind of deeply wrong with you? And so you need to give these extraordinary efforts in order to kind of make up for it. I think that question of motivation really gets into a lot of this material and a lot of these questions.
Completely true. In other words, if the frame here is that I am broken, things are deeply missing, if that continues to be your frame while you engage in repair and renewal, well, you still haven't changed that underlying frame.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And then there is the way in which even well-intended, sincere efforts within a certain problematic frame can serve the function of perpetuating the frame. And then you have these, I think, bad actors who will manipulate people who are hurting and longing to be happier and released from their burdens, will keep them engaged in the quest, the endless quest of self-improvement, because, well, that sells ever more seminars. Level 17.
That's definitely something we're going to be talking about today, the whole self-help industrial complex, the whole thing, which, we are to at least some extent a part of. And I think that that's why this conversation is so interesting, because we're a piece of this puzzle in terms of the content that we create. And then that really affects how I think about the kinds of things that I want to talk about on the show. Like, what's really of value to people, what could cause people to slide more into that unhealthy relationship with this kind of content. It's something that I think about frequently. And so part of what we're doing here is I'm just kind of thinking out loud about the stuff that's been churning around my head for the past 18 months or so.
The pitfalls that you're naming are not unique to the very modern self-help industry.
Sure,
I mean, if
totally
you
true.
go back, I've learned that there, at least in America, probably elsewhere in the world, yeah, I'm sure going farther and farther back, there are these advice books.
Oh, the Stoics. Sure, totally.
Yeah, the Stoics are the people that, there's a long place. And then think about other cultures, the Tao Te Ching, other great texts, religious texts. So there's a longstanding effort to offer counsel to people and tools that they can then use themselves. It's not specific to
for
the
sure.
modern forms, right? Of, Dr. Phil, you and me.
And the phrase snake oil itself has a long history. Like, this wasn't invented in the kind of 1970s with the modern arrival of self-help books. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And in all that, some of the pitfalls, frankly, are found in religious quarters in which people are told, that basically you were born in sin, you're living in sin, you need to keep doing these various things to prove your worthiness to an angry God, or other versions that because you were a bad person in a former life, so you need to put up with your fate in this life, which, by the way, advantages people who are in upper caste positions. So that these pitfalls are, they're out there in the world, not just in sort of the self-help people.
Totally. And that's basically where I want to start, with aspects of what you were just talking about, Dad. And the way I think about this category is the problems with the word self in the phrase self-help.
Okay.
So when the individual is the primary unit of analysis, all problems become personal problems. When what we're looking at is you as a person, and our whole framework is what you're doing to change yourself and improve in these different kinds of ways, it all becomes about you. So why do people come to self-help in general? Why do they walk into your office, Dad?
They're hurting.
They're hurting.
Very often.
So the core premise in self-help is that if you do this thing, you person who are in pain, your life will get better. You'll feel less pain if you do this thing. In other words, the individual is the primary unit of change. You are in control. So what does this suggest? Well, if you feel bad, it's because you didn't do the thing enough, right? The responsibility for your well-being is placed very directly onto the individual. And I think with all of the things we're going to talk about today, there's an aspect of them that actually is useful or aspirational in a funny kind of way. There's this huge forwarding and foregrounding of agency in what I'm talking about here. And we talk about the importance of personal agency all the time on the podcast, right? People's lives tend to change when they start to take more responsibility for what's going on in them. But again, there's that middle path. There's that balance between I am the sole creator of my problems and it is my sole responsibility to change them, and, oh, life just happens to me and I can't do anything about it. Both of those versions are not great versions. And it's really easy for people. I think people's general tendency a lot of the time is to fall a little bit more into the second one. They feel essentially victimized by the course of life for a lot of understandable reasons, in part because the world is complicated and overwhelming and social factors really do matter a lot. But the self-help industry tends to create more of that first problem. You're the problem. Do this thing. Your problem will get better. If it doesn't get better, it's because you didn't do my thing well enough. And this then plays into everything you were talking about, Dad, in terms of certain individuals who are kind of incentivized to make their thing the only thing, in part so they can sell you that thing. And if somebody says, hey, your thing didn't work for me, well, it takes a kind of advanced teacher to say, you know what, maybe I should change the teaching. Or, you know what, you're right, my teaching doesn't work for everybody. CBT really isn't the answer for every person who walks into therapy, or somatics really isn't the answer for everybody who walks into therapy. There's an issue of fit here. So that's what I would start with, this kind of issue with the focus on the self entirely in the broader self-help universe. What do you think about that?
It's really kind of interesting. The better the tool, the more important it is to have a certain skepticism about it. I think as an analogy, if you look on the history of medicine, let's say, and you look at, let's say, the 20th century, if you were to choose the top five in terms of real benefits for people, inventions in the 20th century, I think arguably I'd put reliable birth control number one, actually, in terms of its profound beneficial implications, historic implications.
We're really staying away from controversy during this episode, Dad. We've got birth control. We've got critiques of the self-help industrial complex. I said that Han shot first at the beginning of the. I mean, we're really stepping in it here.
Hey, it comes with it. It comes with a shirt.
It
right?
comes with a black shirt. It comes with a black shirt. That's
The
right.
other
We
Rick
got
is here.
unhinged Rick coming in hot. No. I mean, I think that there is a extremely strong argument for exactly what you're saying, and I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Anyways, keep on going,
also,
Dad. I didn't mean to derail. I just thought it was
it's
funny.
great. And in that category, we have obviously antibiotics like penicillin. The development of that massively, and among other things, would include psychotropic medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and all the rest of that, psychostimulants, used carefully and well. The problem, though, is when someone, let's say professionally, has access to a fantastic toolkit of psychotropic meds, it's really easy for them to become reductionistic and to look at the suffering soul word deliberately chosen, walking in the door, to reduce that person to some kind of biochemical process that their tool might be able to fix. And similarly, the tremendous research on human psychology and the mind in the last 100 years with tremendous tools actually can then lead therapists, let's say, or self-help teachers broadly into an over-reliance on that particular tool. I think that's completely true. My own personal framing that I think is much more useful is implicit in your critique, which is that, when we're with people, to really acknowledge that so many of our person's issues and problems are caused by things outside their front door. The economy, the political systems of the last 10,000 years, which have generally looked more like Game of Thrones, than the decision-making process in bands of 40 to 50 people that our ancestors used for 97% of the time our species has walked this earth. These are causes outside the front door, and it's important to acknowledge them and also acknowledge causes that have to do with other people, ways we were raised, the genetic lottery of individual variation, peers. You've spoken very courageously about the impact on you of other kids and peer groups and dynamics there. And then think about the causes of that, the way the school system is structured and the way kids are disconnected from ordinary life and put in these kind of places like schools and malls where it's Lord of the Flies a fair amount of the time, blah, 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 blah. So these are social forces. That said, in that context, what can the individual do about them?
Yeah.
So now you've contextualized it, and you've made me realize that, frankly, I think the truth is that I've never thought of this before. You made me realize it, that often some of what has brought a person to walk in the door is the knowing at some level inside, even if it's only semi-conscious, that they're shooting themselves in the foot in some ways, and they'd like to find out more.
Totally.
And it's a vulnerable, courageous, even sacred unpacking, and with someone who's relatively safe, that they can actually talk about that part of the whole, but that part with.
And I think that a big aspect of this in terms of what keeps it in the healthy category versus the, slightly less healthy category is the relationship that this whole selfing process has with shame and with how much shame we feel.
Wow.
Because if responsibility for your well-being and your happiness and how well things are going for you in life is placed on the individual, without that consideration for context that we're talking about here, Dad, that is a fast track to shame. That is a fast track to it is all my fault. I am not good enough to be able to achieve in this kind of situation that we're in. And then sometimes what happens is for people who buy into self-help content for an extended period of time, and they do a lot of the work inside of themselves, is they start essentially projecting that onto other people. Oh, you see that person over there? They haven't done the work enough to be functional in this situation. And just to opine for a second, something that I've definitely seen, Dad, and I'm curious for starters how willing you are to talk about this and your sort of openness around it. But man, performative personal development is certainly everywhere on social media. You bump into a lot of self-help content and it really feels like it's a kind of competition for the person to show off like how healed they are, how awakened they are, whatever it is. And there can be a similar vibe in some personal growthy spaces and some like mindfulness spaces and other things like that, where it feels like it's a bit of a competition to be the most kind of awakened individual inside of the space, or to be the most out there in how you talk or think about things. And as a pretty mainstream, pretty science-driven person, who is also a part of these communities to some extent, I've definitely bumped my head into that. Where I'm just like, maybe this isn't my lane. Maybe I've walked into the wrong room here or something. But the performative aspect of it really grinds my gears sometimes.
I relate. I I entered the human potential stream, gosh, late 60s, pretty young, going off to college and onward. And you're right. And the version of it I entered into was the sort of LA version of that, which I think had some of the cultural infusion of Hollywood and, your persona and your image and what you present to the world. I totally know what you're talking about. A reflection on it is this: much as people can be very engaged with status seeking around money and their partners, their cars, their, all the rest of it.
You can get status seeking everywhere.
Yeah.
Totally
and
right.
you can
Anywhere,
go
anywhere and everywhere. You can go to that place anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm the humblest person in the room.
Totally.
Right?
No, absolutely. And I think that it's really important to just have a moment where you go, hey, this is everywhere. No place is immune to it just because of the content that they're looking at. Status is everywhere and power games are everywhere. And just because people are a little bit more kind of psychologically knowledgeable doesn't mean that those power games go away.
The thing that I've been aware of myself is, what's it like for me to be around people that are farther along in their practice than I am? And we could analogize that to, you're a decent tennis player, and then you start, rallying with Rafael Nadal, and you just realize, wow, it's farther along. So then what do you do with that? And I think skillfully, you observe how they're farther along and you embrace the next possible steps for you from that example, while also appreciating that all kinds of causes and conditions have led to where you are. And this is a little tricky to talk about. You can also observe that some other people in various aspects, let's say, of emotional intelligence, are not as far along as you are. And that discerning recognition needs to not slide into superiority and dominance. Just as in any other area, this one too.
Yeah. No, totally right on, Dad. And I think that you're also kind of speaking to the fundamental attribution error, which is one of the most consistent findings that we have in terms of cognitive biases that people have. And it's just the tendency to overestimate personality traits and underestimate situational factors when we look at other people's behavior. And this includes a kind of moral judgment of people who are struggling. And I think that you can really see a lot of stuff in the self-help world where that sort of moral judgment comes in, that kind of sense of inherent superiority that we've been talking about. And, look, there's kind of that healthy balance there with all of these things. Yes, a person might have a real problem in their life that they're really trying to deal with, but theoretically, personal development work should be an antidote to shame.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be something that increases the amount of shame that you're experiencing. So maybe if we're looking for kind of takeaways here, that's something to keep an eye on. Are you engaging with a practice or with a teacher who makes you feel worse about yourself or makes you feel better about yourself?
Yeah.
Do they make you feel worse about other people or better about other people? And I think that one there, that worse about other people, man, that's something to really keep an eye on.
Well, what's great is how much you really are foregrounding selfing.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful line that makes a lot of sense in print. It goes, love yourself. Yourself is one word. Love yourself. Just don't love your two words, self. And that distinction right there.
Totally.
And it really is kind of a sweet spot in which we have tenderness for ourselves much as we have for other people. That's kind of, I guess, it's part of the broad principle of inner and outer, same, same. So the same skillfulness, the same best practices that apply to the outer world also apply to the inner world, same, same. And as part of that, something that has helped me as someone who grew up with a lot of vulnerability to what's called narcissistic injury, where I just felt devalued and excluded by others. And so there is an understandable tendency, given that history, to engage in problematic forms of striving around impressing others and self-improvement, to have an ever shinier mask to present to the world. And something that really helped me was to realize that it was most in my best self-interest to disengage from trying to prove myself or to others or to impress them about me. That was actually the best thing I could do for myself. And it helped me to realize that very often in any social gathering, whether it's just people hanging out in your living room, Forrest, talking and stuff, or in a workshop setting with a bunch of muckety mucks, and you're also in that group, the person who is least engaged with impressing others, typically over time, is clearly the most impressive person in the room. And realizing that can be helpful.
I think that's a great point, Dad. And this takes me a bit to the second thing that I really wanted to emphasize here about the self part of all of it, which is this excessive preoccupation that can come in when we are taught that the self is the primary unit of measurement here, when it's all about you and it's about your engagement with the practice, your engagement with the world, all roads lead back. Well, if all roads lead back to you, why wouldn't you spend a lot of time thinking about yourself? And so there can be this kind of self-preoccupation that sneaks into the personal growth inquiry that I'm not sure is actually supportive of it or not, and can absolutely lead to a lot of problems that we've talked about on the show in the past. A lot of navel gazing, a kind of endless preoccupation with your inner world, all the way up to various forms of somewhat narcissistic behavior, if not like full-on narcissistic behavior. And that may be an aspect of this that I think has become more of a topic recently and has a lot of complexity to it. And so I just want to nod in the direction of that complexity. But just this kind of undermining of both principles of interdependence, how we are reliant on systems and other people, and this sort of downplaying of how important those things are for individual growth or individual development. And then something we've talked about on the show really frequently, this sort of mistaking of insight and introspection for being genuine change or genuine growth. That kind of question that we'll answer periodically on the mailbag, some version of, well, my therapist thinks that I'm just like so insightful and I have so many wise things to say about myself, but I've still got all of these problems. What's going on? And it's like, well, because insight isn't the only thing here. It's not just about self-preoccupation. It's about actually doing something with it. Is that something that you see in the field as an issue? Or is this more like people who are engaging at the level of Instagram memes?
Well, a bit of history in the village that I've lived in since the late 1960s. There has been, in the field of clinical psychology, certainly, some very forceful critiques. There have been forceful critiques of the individualistic framing and locus of control. On the one hand, again, it's like a great hammer that's really useful. There's this notion in psychology, where do you view control in your life? Do you view it as externalized, that you're kind of a puppet pulled by many strings? Or do you have a strong sense of a locus of control, including in how you respond to the strings that are pulling on you? That's much more internal. Well, in psychology, there's a pretty strong emphasis on helping people establish a greater sense of internal locus of control. Well, that's part of a broad focus on things that are useful, but yet can be incorporated into or co-opted by different frames and forces that lead people to place an excessive burden of responsibility on themselves, and also can be used to divert attention from social factors, economic factors, poverty, injustice. The greatest mental health issue in the world, certainly in America, is poverty.
Yeah, by far.
Yeah.
It's not particularly close. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to improve mental health, raise people out of poverty. Hello. And there are obvious ways to do that. So all that's in the mix. And I think it's a very fair critique. On the other hand, we have a situation where very often people will use some part of a very worthy whole, and they'll fixate on that particular part to critique the whole and to distract attention, frankly, from the benefits of the whole with regard to concerns about that part. Well, yeah, let's address concerns about that part while also appreciating what is really good about the whole. And
sure.
just because
middle pathing again.
Yeah, just because a typical person walking into a 1-hour class in their work setting on mindfulness, or walking into my office, say, just because they don't come in with a Marxist critique of of late stage capitalism, it doesn't mean that it's the job of the therapist or the mindfulness teacher to bring to bear that critique. They're not there in the room for that stuff. On the one hand. On the other hand, it's important to be kind of attentive to what is left out and the usages in different ways of what's left out. So I think about, definitely that part.
Part of what you're alluding to is, for lack of a better way of putting it, and again, might get into a little bit of hot water here, a sort of underlying neoliberalism in the way that the self-help industry tends to operate. The individual is the primary driver of things. It's about personal responsibility.
That's right.
It's kind of this very Western, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If we just deregulated everything, then it would all be okay because individuals would be able to kind of shine through without being burdened by whatever. Again, we talk about agency all the time on the show. There are aspects of it where I'm like, yeah, absolutely. The kind of power to the people part of it, where it's like, yes, people can change their lives and they can pull themselves up. Yeah. But hello, we're situated inside of a broader context. And that's the piece that often gets lost.
I think that's right. And it is interesting the degree to which many people in the self-help space are very progressive and I would say social democratic. Still, there are some people in the self-help space, I'll call it self-improvement space, who do tend to tilt toward laissez-faire capitalism and more that rugged individualistic frame. I was myself, I've never told you this story. So I took a class at UCLA when I was an undergrad in economics, basic economics 101. And I was just kind of bowled over by how hard it was. And so I dropped out of that class, because I wanted to preserve my grade point average. So, the economy, wow, I'm late to that. And it took me a long time. I thought that neoliberalism, well, what's wrong with liberalism? Neo is great, but no. It really means Darwinian, dog-eat-dog, laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah,
it's robber baron capitalism.
Invisible hand of the market.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Robber baron capitalism.
It gets pretty dark pretty quickly, actually.
It's nothing liberal about it. What BS. It took me a while to realize that. Oh, no. Anyway, now on the other hand, I think a lot, though, notwithstanding the ways we're banging these drums, a lot of these concerns are really not germane. They fall away when people are engaging in the actual work.
I love this. I love that you're saying this because I think that, and not to cut you off, but I think that a lot of what I am speaking to here is an actual kind of avoidance that people have around like actually engaging with the content. But yeah, go ahead.
Beautiful. Yeah, you got it. It's when, just when you're sitting down and someone says, okay, well, let's just sort of try to pay attention to your breath for the next 10 minutes. Your mind wanders, come back. You're right in the middle of it. And preoccupations with trying to impress others, or what is the social embeddedness and situatedness of this practice, diverting attention from global warming, it's not relevant. You're in the work. Or there you are with the therapist, the door closes, and your therapist says, so how are you doing? And what's beneath the surface of that? You're in it. You're in the middle of it. And there's a sincerity to it. I think it's when people are commenting on their personal practice, or they're kind of showcasing it in what you call the highlight reel of their lives on social media. Yeah, I think that's where, a lot of these issues show up. And in the marketing.
In the marketing, it's everywhere for sure. And can I ask you, actually, I'm going to kind of go off the board here a little bit, Dad. This is something that I'm personally very curious about. This might be one of those things where I ask you a relatively simple seeming question and you need to give like a 15-minute answer. And if so, let's try to keep it to like 3 or 4. So
he
in Buddhist
knows
practice,
his father well.
We've done 1 or 2 of these in the past. So in Buddhist practice, there's a lot of talk about self and about selfing and about excessive selfing, too much focus on the self, the underlying nature of the self as this kind of unstable, constantly changing thing, not really wanting to be so preoccupied with it. That being said, in Buddhist practice, there's a lot of thinking about the self, even though the thinking about the self is a kind of critique of thinking about the self. And there's something in that I have just a curiosity about, like, what's the, I don't even know if I know how to ask this properly. Maybe you can just kind of intuit what I'm trying to get at here, where there's this kind of funny thing where there's so much of trying to let it go or move away from it that you actually spend a lot of time really thinking about it. If you think about various psychological practices, we're trying to move people away a lot of the time from a sort of unhealthy preoccupation with their problems. And in doing that, in some ways, we're kind of reinforcing their engagement with them. And it feels like a bit of a tricky dance, and I'm wondering how you think about that or what people have said about this sort of an issue.
So good. So I'm searching for the 3 minutes or less response to the classic question.
Big question, yeah.
Who am I? Right?
Sure.
And embedded even that is, frankly, what do you mean who? And what do you mean I? And what do you mean am? Okay, so it's quite profound. The shorthand statement would be all phenomena are empty. They exist emptily in the sense that because all phenomena are made of processes and relationships, they are empty of absolute inherent essence. Boom, full stop. Now, you can see that if you just kind of, for example, watch your experience of something. Somebody says something, and then there's a reaction to it. That reaction has body sensations, it has emotions, it has thoughts. It's made of parts that are connected and changing. And they are changing in a larger context, a larger web of causes and conditions, which give rise to them and lead them also to pass away. We get that when we look at something like a reaction to someone, especially with a little bit of mindfulness. Out in the wider world, we can recognize that all material phenomena have the same nature as well. In some cases, watching a cloud in the sky or watching the rippling in a river, it's more obvious. When you stare at El Capitan, it's harder sometimes to see that, well, actually that huge physical block has also the same nature, as made of parts that are connected and changing. Okay, so far so good. And it's not philosophy. It's actually incredibly liberating.
Extremely interesting, Dad. I'm wondering what this has to do with how you're connecting the dots here to the question that I was asking about. Okay, yeah. I'm curious where you're going with this. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Because I know you are. I'm just I'm like, ooh, how's this going to line up here? Totally.
So it's incredibly useful. You're watching your reactions to somebody and you're observing, oh yeah, it really is made of parts that are connected and changing. That helps you hold it more lightly and be less implicated by it and less burdened by it.
Totally, yeah.
The one object or the one aspect in the dynamic streaming of consciousness that has the most intractable tendencies to violate these fundamental conditions of processes and relationships, parts that are connected and changing, emptiness, is the sense of me, myself, and I.
Yeah,
that's the one thing that we most reify, we most thingify, we most brickify. And as a result, we then are very vulnerable to different things that make us suffer and also create conflicts and harms with other people. So there's no problem that the sense of self is occurring. And in fact, I always blank on his name, famous psychologist who said, you need to be somebody before you can be nobody. A child, an infant and toddler necessarily starts to develop a strong sense of me, myself, and I. Very important. Without that, it's difficult to function in life. The problem is when we lack insight into its inherently empty nature and identify with it and try to defend it and try to add possessions to it. That's when trouble begins. If the presumption is that there really is an entity in you, Forrest, and an entity in me and others that is unified and enduring and fundamentally independent of all that is else that is happening, those are the defining characteristics of a purported self. But in fact, in both the mind and in the brain, we see that those three conditions of unification, endurance, and independence do not exist at all. In your own mind stream, you can observe that there are many sub-personalities of the self, and it's not unified. It's made of parts. Second, you can see that it is changing. You know, the self that sets the alarm clock for 6 a.m. at night is not the same self who grumbles, who set the damn clock, right? And then same thing, independent. You can see that we're affected by conditions rising and falling. And you see the same thing in the brain, remarkably, with new research. So the assertion that there is an entity that is unified, enduring, and independent is just false. There is no such self. Even if the purported entity, as it is defined here, does not exist, persons absolutely exist. Persons, a unified body-mind process that has continuity over time. Persons, the person process, and made of parts that are connected and changing. And persons matter. Persons have rights and responsibilities. And paradoxically, the more that we love and tend to and care for persons, them and ourselves, the lighter the hold of self becomes. And then just last, since we're in this dive, one of the hardest things to realize is that ongoing sense of subjectivity. When you said, okay, now here's a person who's reflecting on themselves, right? Does that reflecting process and related executive processes of nudging and repairing and guiding and so forth, does that not reinforce the mistaken belief in a self?
Yeah, and that's kind of my question.
Exactly right. And that's where the kind of insight that I'm, moving through is really helpful. A kind of detachment from the selfing process, and frankly, a certain disenchantment with it when you realize how much suffering comes from possessiveness and clinging and, me, myselfing and impressing and the burdens of that. What's left is the subjectivity of the witnessing. Here's the witnessing process in you as you think of yourself in the third person. That witnessing process, that I perspective, feels so close to a self, right? It's kind of the last to go. And it's so helpful to realize that moments of subjectivity do not necessarily constitute a subject. The brain continually tries to trick us into thinking as it indexes across moments, it finds that which is continuous or has continuity across those moments. Moments of subjectivity are misinterpreted by the brain with good intent as a subject. But in fact, all that is true are moments of subjectivity. That is what is true.
To maybe grossly simplify a lot of what you've said here, Dad, you can work on the self without being so attached to the self. And in fact, that recognition of the unstable, changing nature of it actually is what kind of helps you do that. It's sort of hanging on to or keeping awareness of that sort of emptiness that allows you to work on self without being so caught up in it.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe a way to just be careful with the words. Self is a tricky word because it's routinely used in two completely different ways.
Yeah, I'm using it in the colloquial work on yourself way.
Yeah. You're there, self equals person. Oh yeah. Work on the person.
Work on the
psyche.
person.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Work on the person and use yourself for that purpose while also having deeper and deeper and more embodied and granular and in real time uh, realization of the fundamental emptiness of the selfing process.
Great. So now that I have led us down that deep rabbit hole that we could easily do several episodes on, I want to bounce back up and out to the third thing that I was kind of focused on today, in terms of my consideration of this, like, what's the problem with self-help question. And it's like totally different from everything we were just talking about, which I love. And in fact, in a weird sort of way, I feel like this is kind of a weirdly good example of sort of the opposite of what I'm about to talk about, which is like self-help as hustle culture. And hustle culture. Yeah. So there's this big conversation. I have no idea how plugged in you are to this, Dad. The answer is probably not very. There's this big conversation going on socially right now about the idea of hustle culture, which is like this idea of having a grind set. You want to grind away on your work. You really want to focus on improving yourself. You really want to squeeze everything you possibly can out of your professional experience. You want to get stuff from life to a certain extent, right? And you can see a lot of echoes in the language that is used in self-help world from that. Self-help commonly frames the person as a project, just as we were talking about right there with the selfing stuff. I'm working on myself is a very common phrase you'll hear people say. And this is very similar to hustle culture, which suggests that the individual should be kind of constantly striving to produce more stuff or optimize themselves or achieve at a certain kind of level. You've got these phrases like the grind never stops, or even like the very capitalistic version of, fuel your hustle with fuel, or whatever's going on out in the world at a given moment. And this kind of project mindset, like the person as project, I do think makes sense in some specific circumstances. When do projects make sense? They make sense when the project is meaningful to you, when you care about it. We're starting with pain. You want the pain to get better. Okay, great. The goal is pretty achievable and is very clearly defined. Suffering along the way, the bad stuff that happens to you as you move through it, is pretty well controlled. And then, really importantly, there is some kind of endpoint. That's the definition of a project, right? It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. Projects don't run forever. If they run forever, they are not a project. They are a path. And the only reason to stay on the path is if the path feels good. That's it. As if you like it. But you kind of see people get sucked into this thing where the project is sort of endless. The goalposts are always getting pushed back. But the path itself doesn't really seem to feel that good to them. And I think a lot of people get sucked into that when it comes to self-help content. I'm wondering how much of that you've seen and what you think about this kind of interplay between the hustle of self-help and all of this.
I think you are very correct to name risks, pitfalls, essentially dualisms, in which there is this observer and then there's this entity over here, the damaged, broken, inadequate, flawed self person. That being over here, as it were, witness over here, is trying to fix or improve or polish for all kinds of reasons, including sometimes to impress others. Like right there is a separation, a dualism. We're separated from it. And same thing with projecting a future. If I just sort of keep polishing my mind, someday I'll look like them, who are super cool and have 100,000 Instagram followers. And that leads into the medicine for that, based on that diagnosis, which is to say union, having a sense of unity and being whole, in which, prudently, you are having compassion for yourself and a tenderness for yourself and an awareness of yourself as a person, the psyche you are, and also wisely, striving a little bit every day, nudging a little bit every day, taking in the good along the way to grow the good that lasts inside, crucially, that in a way that's unitive. And also, in terms of the dualism between present and future, here too can be a kind of unity in which one is rested in the present while planting the seeds and fertilizing the ground of causes and conditions that will lead to a better future, while being in the present throughout that entire process. Those two approaches are really helpful, to deal with the risks you're talking about. And then more generally, I'm interested in this phenomenon of hustle culture. And I'm going to say something maybe consistent with my, the other Rick today, but is it, I think you're describing, right, a kind of a culture that's coming, or a kind of hustle culture that's mainly grounded in younger people, right?
There's been a rejection of this by and large by younger people. So that's really what's changed, is that people more this was more of a thing kind of for people in my generation, more like millennial age people, where this became a big social movement around essentially a kind of self-betterment, but really self-betterment that was like very financially focused, or the idea that like an achieving person is somebody who is really on the grind, would be a phrase that somebody might use. And you should seek out other people who match that kind of level of grind, because you're going to really go somewhere in life.
Yeah. And what generational cohort is that for?
A millennial. That's very, very millennial, a little bit Gen X, a little tiny bit like old Gen Z. But this has been almost entirely rejected by the body of Gen Z culture, as near as we can tell. There's been a total pushback against this that has moved in almost the opposite direction. Like bed rotting is a word / phrase that's become very popular, because there's increasingly this sense of like, dude, where are we trying to go?
Yeah.
And it's housed in a sort of broader feeling of lack of achievement and accomplishment, based on the kind of similar age markers that they saw their parents reach, where they're in their mid-20s, they're still living at home, they feel kind of disenchanted, they don't see the kind of work opportunities or the kind of economic opportunities that their parents had, or whatever it is. So it's housed inside of a broader social context. So this has been really pushed back against by younger people.
Oh yeah, that critique sounds good. And of course, middle way, right?
Yeah, all middle way. Yeah, you want to do something. Totally.
And individual differences. Some people, their just nature is to sort of amble through life. And other people, their nature is they wake up in the morning and they kind of brush the dust off and they get the neurons going and they look out and they go, oh, okay, what fence do I need to mend today? What hills would I like to climb? What corn do I want to plant? And they're just kind of that way. I'm sort of that way. What do I want to learn? And so forth. And the point is, these are normal and fine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And somebody could come into therapy because they had a problem on either side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
They could come into therapy because they're a chronic overworker, and they could come into therapy, or we get questions on the podcast about overwork. And we also get questions on the podcast. We just did a mailbag recently where there were a lot of questions about kind of failure to launch. And I feel bad about myself because I don't feel like I've hit these various metrics, or I haven't gotten to the place that I want to get to in my life. So yeah, absolutely. You can have problems on either side. And I think that maybe a sub point here is how all of this kind of hustle mindset, or working on yourself mindset, can easily lead to a kind of pathologization of just normal human experiences. We go through phases in life. We have phases where everything falls apart. We have phases where we feel like there's a rocket strapped to our ass. It goes both ways, And so there can be this kind of appreciation for just like the normalcy of that, the normality of it, as opposed to sort of framing everything as this problem that needs to be solved.
Forrest, just before we started, we were chatting about two books, one of which you co-authored with me, Resilient, as well as Hardwiring Happiness. And just the reach of those books and the ripples from them. And in both of those books is a central notion, to put it a certain way, I'll say it, start from the green zone. What I mean by that, as is as best you can, when you can, find an authentic sense of your three primary needs being met enough in the present. Needs for safety, satisfaction, and connection, met enough in the present so that your psyche, your mind, is sort of pervaded to some meaningful extent by peacefulness and contentment and love. And on that basis, reach for the stars, whatever those stars may be for you. So it's on the basis of feeling already full, already balanced, rather than missing something or something is wrong, that you're moving forward in life.
And are you able to cultivate that? Yeah.
Yeah,
Like what
and you
helps
can
you, what
cultivate
helps you
that
feel
and
that way?
develop
Totally.
that, and I think that's is another way of saying, in terms of managing the risks and the pitfalls here, to the extent that people are already rested in that sense of enoughness, then they're less vulnerable or to the pitfalls of unhealthy striving.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. And that, I think, takes us pretty smoothly to the final thing that I really want to talk about today, because we've been talking about the middle path a lot. And we've been talking about how the individual can easily take things too far either way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, congratulations. There is a whole ecosystem of content and creators and so on who are heavily incentivized to help you take things too far. And that's the broader self-help universe, essentially. There's a whole ecosystem that encourages people to do just that. It's really difficult to estimate the size of the personal development market, but the ballpark number that I saw when I looked into it a little bit is that it was worth roughly $50 billion last year. If the self-help market were a person, it would be one of the richest people in the world. Personal growth is quite literally a product category. And a great way to make money is by finding new things for people to feel insecure about. And the problem with this fundamentally is that the incentive structure changes for people who create content. When the incentive is to keep somebody buying things, contentment is bad for business. Well, theoretically, what we're trying to get people to is contentment. We're trying to get them to, I feel pretty darn good just the way that I am. And so you've got this kind of inherent conflict a little bit. I think that most people navigate that content or that conflict in the space pretty well. I think that most people are very genuine about wanting to help people and wanting to support them through their problems. If you are writing a book to become a millionaire, you're making a really bad decision in life and you should choose a different field. You will probably not become a millionaire from writing a book. Very, very hard lift for that one. Most books sell like 100 copies on average, if that. So you kind of, I don't think that this is necessarily a field that attracts people who are really cynical in that way. Most people are coming from a pretty good place. Man, do you see a lot of marketing? Do you see a lot of salesiness? Do you see a lot of, to use a phrase that you've used ironically in the past ad, my brand is authenticity, that kind of whole piece of it. You see a lot of that out there and it's just tough. There's something about the dichotomy between the overt salesiness, the all Instagram everything, and the actual like content itself that I have a really hard time squaring internally. Now, somebody who's been down the rabbit hole here, I'm wondering how you think about all of this.
Well, what came up right there was a sense of, I guess, compassion for people who turn the self into an object, and they're selling their self because they are the brand. They are the walking embodiment of the fruits of practice.
And then that takes us to this total inauthenticity performance aspect. Yeah, totally.
And think about what a burden it is on a person to be internally divided in that way and continually caught up in the manufacturing of this product, which is the commodified, thingified self. And then if people don't like your product, it's not that they don't particularly care for this version of spaghetti sauce. It's that they don't care for a purported you that is distinct from you, but
I've wrestled with this a lot myself, buddy. Yeah. No, when the success of the podcast or the content or whatever else is closely tied to my sense of like myself as a communicator or myself as a desirable person to hang out with for an hour as you listen through your headphones, oof, that's a tough sledding when an episode doesn't do as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to make kind of a key distinction here, you're not presenting yourself as some kind of shiny object that others should emulate. And
if anything, quite the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. And give you money to become like.
Sure. Yeah. No, right? Totally true. Yeah.
And I think about these people in show business and, kind of on the talk show circuit where their personality is the product. And it kind of goes to the degree to which, gosh, the drug addiction rate and the probably suicide rate among many people in show business world is so high because you presented yourself to the world as this shiny object of peak self-actualization, and people don't like it. I have compassion for people kind of caught up in that chase.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, and as always, you're a bit of a contrarian in sort of a funny way where I sort of come at it from one angle and you're like, yeah, but don't you feel bad for them? I was like, wow, I hadn't really thought. I mean, maybe I do.
I don't mean like
I'm,
superior. I just mean, it's like kind of a hell realm to
yeah,
live in.
I feel way worse for the people who are kind of being exploited by this process, to be transparent.
For sure.
I appreciate where you're coming from with it and the kind of common humanity aspect of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I do think that a sort of appreciation for the various pressures on different groups can help us understand why things are the way that they are. The aspect of this that I think is kind of tricky is the part of it that seems somewhat aimed, two pieces of it. First part is the part that is aimed at keeping people on the hamster wheel. Are we trying to get people off the hamster wheel? Are we trying to graduate them? Or are we just trying to keep people in engagement with this, where there's kind of this eternal sense of some problem to be fixed, or, well, you haven't quite solved this thing, whatever it is. The second piece of it, though, is the way that the capitalism of it all really alters people's incentive structure about the kind of content that they promote broadly. And this feeds into all of the pseudoscience and all of just like the slop, frankly, that's out there in the industry. If our primary metric of success is like how many people download an episode of a podcast, or how many people click on a like on an Instagram post or something like that, this means that we're prioritizing content that gets a lot of clicks. Well, what does this mean about that content? Typically, that there's going to be a lot of generalizing and a lot of oversimplification and a lot of playing to what people already think about something. So if there's an idea that's already, there are episodes where I know that they're going to do better, or I know that they're going to do worse because they're about a popular topic, or they're reinforcing something that people already believe about things. If I do an edgier episode that I think by definition is actually a longer lever because it's more different from the audience of the podcast that I'm speaking to, right? So it could actually move people a little bit more in terms of how they think about themselves, because the distance is a little bit greater between sort of what I'm putting on the table and what they already think. Guess what? Most of the time that episode isn't going to do as well. I'm not incentivized to create that kind of content, even though the utility of it could potentially be really high for people. That puts you in a bit of a bind as a content creator, right? And I think that it's a complicated part of the whole thing that people don't really talk about enough. I don't know if you've ever grappled with this, Dad. You've just mostly written what kind of came to mind for you.
Well, in my own journey, I was very drawn to write what I cared about. So the first book was Mother Nurture 25 years ago, because your mom and I were young and you were there, and I was blown away.
It was the problem you were dealing with.
Yeah, by the impact of the transition to parenthood. And then other interests of mine led to Buddhist brain and then the books that followed on. What you're really talking about, I'm just kind of reflecting on this. We're talking about the pitfalls in commodifying yourself as a psyche, your person, your psyche, commodifying yourself. And also pitfalls in marketing yourself to others in ways that are often not mercantile. They're not, financially structured, but they're about seeking approval from others, being impressed by you, seeking inclusion, seeking social supplies. There's a lot that can be gained from this exploration we've been having about how do we ourselves commodify ourselves, reify ourselves, and try to present a persona to others that will get their approval and validation. And one thing I've been reflecting on, to be really, really blunt about it, is just the factual realization that in my personal experience, most people really suck at appreciating others. So if you are someone who is seeking appreciation, validation, approval, and so on. From others, wow, it's a long and lonely process, and it will have a lot of disappointment in it. And that's just worth knowing. So then what you're left with as wisdom is kind of like I think we've been exploring, is to really focus on what is genuinely authentic, genuinely sincere, and is intrinsically rewarding, regardless of the roar, the boos, or the cheers of the crowd. Because honestly, the crowd is a fickle mistress and it'll break your heart. And if you do what you do to win its approval, you will most likely be pretty unhappy much of the time.
In terms of giving advice to people about this, I think the thing to really pay attention to is how hard is somebody trying to sell you something, for starters? And how accessible do they make their content when they're not selling something? We have, not to toot our own horn here, but hey, I will for a moment. We sell paid courses. Rick sells a lot of paid courses. At the start of many episodes of the podcast, I say, hey, Rick's got this paid course. You can go check it out. We also have 400 free episodes of a podcast. And I got to tell you, I got to peel back the curtain here a little bit. I might at some point in the future create an online program. I probably will, because I would love to be able to pay for my kids to go to college. And, I think that that's going to be the way that it happens. I don't think it's going to be through just podcast advertising revenue alone or whatever it is. There's probably not going to be a single darn thing in that paid course that I haven't already said on the podcast somewhere. It's just probably not. What you're paying for is the organization, and it all kind of be in the same place at the same time, and with a clear roadmap associated with it. Maybe a couple of novel words that kind of finally do the trick for somebody. But I'm totally transparent about it. And if and when I do marketing for this course, somewhere on the marketing page, I am going to say, you're probably not going to find anything novel here. That's going to be part of my marketing language. I'm just going to be transparent about it. If you want to listen to 500 episodes of the podcast or whatever, you can find it probably. It's just about, are you willing to do that kind of labor? And hey, I've done you the favor of kind of collecting everything around this particular topic into this, convenient online program or whatever. Yeah. But I'm not lying about it, right? There's a transparency to it. And I just see such a difference between that and these kind of like mastermind programs that are often extremely, extremely expensive that people do, where there's this sense that like this will be the thing that really finally gets you to that like next level of where you need to go. And I'm just like, hold on. I just don't like that, just fundamentally. And I would have a really hard time kind of operating my business in that way.
As you know, and many people know, every paid offering I have is available for free.
Yeah, it's all scholarship.
To anyone who asks. Basically,
totally, yeah.
We have two questions essentially. What circumstances lead you to ask for the scholarship, and what do you hope to gain? And whatever people say, we do it. And you're also talking about, again, bringing it down to both the individual level and also people in the content creator space. I think it's okay to be aware of your impact on others and the response to your presentation. Any skillful speaker is tuned into their audience.
Oh, for sure.
You're doing that while also continually coming back to, am I doing what I'm doing inside the lines? Am I operating within my integrity system? Am I being true to my nature? And at the end of the day, are my motives pure? Am I, I'm here in service, and I'm also here appropriately to be satisfied myself with what I'm doing. For me, a kind of a standard is, would I still want to do this, whatever this is, if there were only one person in the room with me? I would. I'd feel a little sad. And we spent all that money on renting the hall, and there's only one person. But I would still do it because the material
wasn't the best business investment, but you still feel good about it. Yeah, totally.
I love the material, and there's a person there, and you just don't know.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's a really
and I think
fair
that's
way
okay interpersonally, that here we are with our roommates, our family members, our in-laws, Uncle Bob, all the rest. And we're paying attention to how what we're doing will land, while at the same time being grounded in what is authentically true to us, and also rewarding or satisfying or meaningful for us along the way.
Well, I think this is a tricky one to kind of put a tidy bow on at the end of it here. We normally have more of a what to do or takeaways for people as they get to the end of the episode. And I think that I would mostly return to the three things that I mentioned at the very beginning of it, maybe to loop back to that a little bit. What have we talked about over and over again here? We've talked about the middle path. We've talked about kind of balancing between these different sorts of extremes and being conscious of what's going on as you're engaging with this content. The other thing that I think is really important is continuing to explore, why is it that you're doing what you're doing? Is self-help kind of your fun hobby? That's great. A lot of people engage with self-help content or psychology content in general just because they love learning about the mind. And they're just into it. They're like, oh, wow, limerence, what a cool idea. Or like, oh, attachment styles. Like, wow, I'm really into that. Kind of for the same reason that like the Myers-Briggs test or whatever is a very popular test. It's just sort of a fun thing that people are into. Or are you engaging with this content because a lot of people have said a lot of words about how if you don't, you're kind of failing yourself in some kind of way. Or if you don't, you're not really working hard. Or if you don't, you should be kind of ashamed of yourself. Like that's the piece of it that I would really recommend that people kind of keep an eye on. Because it's just a short jump from the stuff that we're talking about today to feeling a lot of shame and low self-worth as you engage with content that hypothetically should be making you feel better about yourself. And so that's kind of the question I would ask here, bottom line. Like, is it actually doing that? Do you feel better after you read the book, or do you feel worse after you read the book? And I got to tell you, there are a lot of books out there. And if you keep on feeling bad about yourself after you read the book, maybe it's time to find a different book. So that's the bow I would put on this one. You got to impose yourself, Dad?
Love yourself. Just don't love yourself.
Hey, all right, bringing it back. I love it, Dad. Thanks for doing this with me today. This was a really interesting one. I'm really curious what people feel about this one. I really enjoyed this conversation today with Rick about some of the problems that are inherent in the self-help industry and the idea of self-help in general. And I really wasn't so focused on the pseudoscience or the snake oil or the fake gurus or all of that. I was more focused on, even when we wander into the kind of good side of the self-help spectrum, what are some of the implicit issues that tend to come up? And then what's the right balance between being engaged with this kind of content and being just like generally interested in your life and improving, growing, getting better, making things a little better tomorrow than they were today, and this kind of endless preoccupation that people can have with the grind of improvement? There were a few core principles that I encouraged people to hold on to as they went through this consideration. First, the middle path. Extremes are where most of the weird stuff hangs out. So you want to just be a little careful when you start wandering toward one of those extremes. And also this broader principle where we can balance our behavior in different kinds of ways. If we know that we're the kind of person who is really into engaging with a certain kind of content, we can just be aware of that and deliberately tack against it or deliberately balance it out by engaging in a different kind of content. To put this a certain kind of way, because we've stepped in a dozen pitfalls already during this episode, so I might as well do it during the outro as well. I think that homeopathy is very silly. I think that it's pseudoscience. I think that people like to pass it off as like fancy Eastern spirituality, even though it was invented by a German guy in like 1800 or something like that. But look, if you're doing your homeopathic medicine and you're also going to the doctor and, getting your kids vaccinated and all of that, then the downside potential of doing the homeopathy is really pretty limited. You're just kind of doing it because like, hey, why not, right? Another one of those big principles, 90-10, we've talked about this a lot recently. This is the law of diminishing returns. We get most of our value out of a relatively small number of our efforts. And then third, what's your why? Why are you engaging with this stuff? Are you doing it out of a sense of, frankly, shame, disliking yourself, having this internalized sense that you're just not a very good person and so you must work on it? Or are you doing it out of something else? Self-actualization, a desire to contribute to other people, you want to find more fulfillment, whatever it is. And this is basically a way of talking about extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation. It's very understandable to be very extrinsically motivated in a lot of ways. If your partner tells you, hey, our relationship is going to end if you don't go to therapy, that's an extrinsic motivation, but man, it's a pretty motivating one. But generally speaking, intrinsic motivation both feels the best for us, broadly speaking, and also tends to be the longest lasting and lead to just the overall best outcomes in our lives. I started by talking about some of the problems with the word self in self-help, and particularly this idea of the individual, you as a person, as the primary unit of analysis and the primary mover of change in your life. And this was a tricky one for me because, as we know, I am Captain Agency. I am Mr. Look at yourself in the mirror. What can you do to change your life today? All of those platitudes, right? And at the same time, of course, we are individuals that exist inside of a context. We live in a society, and that society has a lot of impact on us in a lot of different ways. And so there's this kind of balance that needs to be found if we're going to have a healthy relationship with it. Where on the one hand, we get that we are contextual individuals, and therefore, if things are going poorly in our life, or we're not able to apply some practice or principle or whatever, it does not in fact mean that there's something deeply wrong with you that you should feel ashamed about. If anything, it's kind of a credit to you that you are willing to engage with stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable. You're willing to try it on, and then you're self-respecting enough to go, hey, you know what? This probably wasn't for me. Bottom line, if you feel bad, it's not necessarily your fault. And it's certainly not something that you should feel a lot of shame around. The second aspect of too much self and self-help that we spent a little bit of time looking at is this kind of excessive preoccupation with themselves that people can get into. If, again, you are the primary mover of change in your life, if you are that primary unit of change, well, why wouldn't you spend a lot of time talking about or thinking about yourself? And this can lead to a lot of the problems that we've talked about on the podcast in the past. Navel gazing, a kind of spiritual self-absorption. If it's balanced, it's great. But if it's just about you and your individual vulnerabilities and all the thoughts that you've had about yourself, well, that's when it starts to just become kind of egocentric. And this can easily lead to some pretty narcissistic behavior, which frankly, you see a lot of in self-help communities. There's also been this sort of downplaying of our natural interdependence and our connection with each other, even including a kind of moving people toward this rugged individualism that Western industrial culture was largely founded on. And I want to focus on this social aspect a little bit here at the end because I didn't talk about it much during the episode. Most people are really imperfect. That's okay. You're imperfect too. I have been very open on the show, and you guys have seen me do some active work on the show, like the episode we had recently with Terry Real, where my demons kind of come out in different sorts of ways, or the issues that I'm struggling with sort of emerge into the space. I don't put on a performance of being this like idealized healed person that other people should aspire to be, much as Rick was talking about toward the end of the episode. Just because people are imperfect doesn't mean that you have to put up with abuse or energy vampires or having your boundaries constantly tested. That's a different kind of thing. But it does mean appreciating that people are typically not going to give you exactly what you want all the time. And just being okay with that, being open to that. There was this incredible line that I bumped into recently. Being annoyed is the price you pay for community. Killer line. And it's so true. Other people annoy us in a million different kinds of ways, but your choice is kind of being annoyed some of the time or being isolated. And it's up to you. What do you want to choose? And this took us to a question that I asked Rick where I said basically, hey, there's a lot of critique of selfing in Buddhism. And what we're doing in self-help is we're, focusing on self a lot. Is there something in our kind of focusing on this that is reinforcing it in a problematic way? And he took this in a really interesting direction where he talked about the nature of self broadly. And in particular, what I want you to really take from that is this idea that you can work on the self. And when I say self in that way, I mean you as a person, engage with the person process of who you are without getting so sucked into a kind of narrow identification with self in the problematic sense, this sort of sense of yourself as this rigid, continuous, unchanging being, which of course we know that's just not how people are. This then took me to my third critique of modern self-help content, which is self-help as a kind of manifestation of hustle culture. There's a big question that we need to ask here. When is enough enough? When are you healed? When have you arrived? When are you allowed to feel good about yourself? In general, it's going to be more sustainable for us if we have that intrinsic motivation toward growth, as opposed to having a specific goal that we're trying to reach. There's a natural movement back and forth from these two things. I have goals all the time. Goals are not intrinsically problematic, but we're really kind of targeting the pleasure of the path itself, right? I want to walk this road not because I'm trying to get somewhere, but because it feels good for me to walk on it, because that's a kind of antidote to constant striving, right? If you enjoy what you're doing, it kind of doesn't matter where you're going. Self-help tends to frame the person as a sort of project, this idea of I'm working on myself. And this is very similar to hustle culture, which suggests that individuals should constantly strive to produce more, optimize their lives, and achieve big dreams, right? We want to seek out somebody who's matching our grind or something like that. This project mindset makes a lot of sense if the project is discrete and if you're mostly enjoying it. But what if it's not? What if it's kind of this endless thing where the goalposts are constantly pushed back? And I think this is really common for people who engage with self help content a lot. It's very easy for the point of different kinds of self work to become some combination of this endless project that doesn't feel good in the moment and also doesn't really have an endpoint. And also skill development that's focused ultimately on being more productive or higher earning or whatever it is, regardless of whether or not that actually feels good to you or lines up with what you want to get out of your life. Then there's this huge performative aspect to the whole thing that I think also shows up a lot in hustle culture. The super complicated morning routine videos that have become very popular recently. And then it feels like this can also play into the pathologization of normal human experiences. That's a bit of a problem in self-help content in general. We have normal ups and downs in life, right? Sadness is not a problem to be solved. It's just an experience. People get sad. It is normal to get sad. Same thing with feeling kind of lost or like you don't really know where you're going or like you're in this sort of fallow period in your life broadly. That's totally normal. And most healthy models of human growth and development over time have a piece of them that's about falling apart. It's these like cycles of disintegration and integration and development. And it's actually that falling apart that helps you get to that next level, whatever the next level is for you. But again, a lot of self-help content emphasizes this idea that you're just supposed to feel good all the time. And if you don't feel good, it's your fault. And that takes us back to the project mentality. This is then all fed into all of these problematic extremes on both sides of the middle path by the overall kind of self-help industrial complex, the $50 billion industry that is built up around self-work and personal development of different kinds. And when we have an incentive structure as content creators in the space that is not focused on helping people feel good and content and just fine as they are, but instead on helping them feel like there is something profoundly wrong with them that they could solve if they just had our $500 yearly course or whatever it is, that's a problem. The incentives are not lined up properly in a way that supports people in actually feeling better about themselves. And to some extent, we're a part of this. And yeah, we try to operate very ethically as creators inside of the space. Rick offers a whole bunch of scholarships for all of his products and programs and online courses and all of that. We have 400 or so episodes of a freely offered podcast. Yes, you do have to suffer through a few minutes of advertising on every episode, but you can sign up for our Patreon and get the ad-free version, so that's pretty cool. And both my biggest and also kind of most shallow personal gripe about the whole thing is just how much garbage there is out there, man. If we're prioritizing clicks and engagement and views and watch time and all of that, the smart move for a creator is to cast the widest net possible. This means prioritizing content that's going to get a lot of those clicks. This typically means a lot of oversimplification, a lot of generalizing, and a lot of reinforcing the beliefs that people already have about a subject. The flip side of this, if I'm trying to find the upside of all of this downside, is that there's been a huge mainstreaming of psychology and self-improvement content in the last couple of decades. It has blown up as an industry. And that has introduced a lot of useful information into people's lives. It's helped them understand themselves, understand their relationships. I think that people knowing a little bit about how to raise kids in a healthy way, or about attachment theory, or about reconciling their own difficult past is just a good thing for people to have access to. Like, that's great. But it's not without its problems. And that's really what we focused on more during today's episode. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a really interesting one to do. I'm very curious how people feel about it. If you've made it this far and you somehow haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, take a moment, click subscribe. Really helps us out. You can watch on YouTube. You can listen on pretty much every podcast platform, Spotify, Apple. I don't know what else people listen on these days, but those are the two big ones. If you're on one of those, leave a comment, leave a positive review. Really helps us out. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment for the algorithm. That really helps us out as well. I already mentioned the Patreon, patreon.com/beingwellpodcast, just a couple of dollars a month. You can sign up and support the show. And do I got anything else? No, I think that's about it. Well, until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.